Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, so today is really to start to dip our toe into the sort of the art and science of facilitating vertical development. And we talk about developing vertical development. Did I just say what I think I said? I think I did. But we'll be in the coming months. We'll be talking about it from a number of different perspectives. And today we just want to kind of like give the overall sort of approach, or the kind of a model or a framework, and you'll do a little bit of work with it. So we'll talk for a while. Then you'll do a little bit of work and get into small groups and do a little bit of work in small groups. And then we'll complete the session with a fairly long conversation to answer questions and to explore whatever pathways might open up. Okay, all right, so without further ado. Actually, just before we put the slides up, I want to take a moment, just take everyone in. And just take a moment to take us in. It's always such a tragedy on Zoom, and the slides come up and then we don't see each other anymore. So. Right, and now here they come. So say bye-bye. Okay, so so today's session is called, could have any number of titles for it, but it's growing inneragility in teams. That's kind of the specific application we're thinking of today, but it's not necessarily just about teams. Just so you know, it could be just about pretty much anything that involves a collective of people. And we say that it's for facilitators and coaches, but it's not just people who have that role. So we think of anybody as taking on a facilitator or a coaching role at any moment, whenever it's needed. And so one of the things that we really want to promote is the idea that of everywhere leadership, and that at any given moment, someone takes the role of the facilitator and coach whenever it's needed and whenever it's called for. So just to say something about the title. Okay. So here's the main question for this session. So the question is, you know what I want to do? I want to pin you, Antoinette. Let me just take a moment so that I can see my co-leader here. Let's see if that works. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so the main question of this session today is, how might we create learning environments that deliberately foster the growth of inner agility? So just kind of let that settle for a moment. There are some things we need to kind of define, but that's what this session is about. And we're going to just kind of establish what we mean by inner agility, what we mean by capability, those kinds of things, and then we'll slowly move into the central ideas here. But we want to say who you are, right? So what we expect you to be, or who we expect you to be, is that you're someone who is in some way committed to fostering capability in other people. So, and however that looks to you, another way of saying this is that you're someone who's committed to growing other people, and mainly growing their capacity to, for thinking, for operating in a complex world. So that's who we would say that you are. And if that's not you, you may not want to be in this session. May not be that interesting or compelling for you. Okay, so definition of inner agility. So let's start with a definition of inner agility. Inner agility is our capacity to orient ourselves in the face of complex and ambiguous situations, such that we're able to sense and respond effectively with whatever is happening in real time. So it's an inherently meaning-making capability. And we're going to say a little bit more about meaning making, but just to say, kind of like, there's this image of the tennis racket and the tennis ball. And for me, that emblemizes really what we're talking about here, because we're talking about being able to meet the world where and when it's happening. So this is a kind of one way to say that you could say that a skilled tennis player is able to meet the game as it's happening. And so there's a certain amount of skillfulness in that, but there's also a certain amount of like how they're able to make meaning of what's going on moment to moment. It's a very cute little child outside my window. So let's invent a kind of way to talk about this. So in order to move forward. So one of the ways that we often talk about this is we think of this in terms of, so we're in the world, right? So, and we're sensing what's going on, right? Whatever it is that we're in the midst of, we're sensing what's going on. And as we're sensing it, we're also making sense of what's going on. We're attempting to understand it. We're attempting to, kind of get a handle on it. How do we want to deal with this? How do we see it? How, all of that. And we respond based on the sense that we're making. We respond, and then we come back to sensing. And it's this is the nature of, we call it sense and respond in the book and elsewhere. It's us kind of sensing and responding, and there's always this making sense that's a part of it, this sense making, which is a part of it. And this happens incidentally, as is the case for everything we're talking about here, whether individually or collectively.
And you will remember that in one of the previous webinars, we actually pulled this a little bit apart to distinguish between sensing and making sense, because there's more than, we spoke about horizontal and vertical development, what Michael has just referred to as the inner game, meeting the ball as it comes to you, and there are also skills and practices that we need to learn to do this. So this is our human sense making is the sum of all of us, all of us in, all of what we have. It's what we can do. It's what we, how we learn to look at things from a sensing perspective. It's our experience in making sense in specific situations, etc. But what's really necessary to know is that it swims in the water of our meaning making. Okay, so whatever we do gets influenced. It doesn't matter what skill we're talking about. Whatever we do gets amplified by the complexity of our meaning making.
And the meaning making is kind of, it's in the background. For the most part, we're unaware of it. It's literally, it is like fish, they swim in the water, right? But the fish don't just swim in the water, they get swum in the water. So the gills get activated by the fact that they're in the water. When they're out of the water, those gills don't work anymore. They literally can't breathe. And same is true for human beings. What it is to be human is to make things. And what humans make most often is meaning. Principally, humans are meaning-making machines. We're doing it constantly. And you could say that it's not us doing it, it's it doing us. The meaning-making parameters, the grammar, the schema, all of that kind of stuff was there before we got born. We get born into it, and to become a human being means to come to a way of making meaning. And as adult development research shows us, that up until a certain age, at least, and this is true in pretty much all cultures, we grow and develop the complexity of that meaning making. And by complexity, we mean to say that that meaning making is able to deal with ever greater complexity of situations. So as a young child, I may believe that when I grow up, I'm going to be my parents' parents, right? And but that's not a very complex way of dealing with the reality of things. And as we get older, we get better and better at being able to make meaning of the world around us. And for most people, that process, that unfolding of development stops beyond a certain age, and that we actually have to be deliberate in creating environments that stimulate the ongoing process of meaning-making development. And ultimately, that's what our work is about at the Center for Inneragility, is to get good at creating environments and helping other people create environments that help others extend their meaning-making complexity beyond where it normally ends up landing in a cul-de-sac.
Dead and unseen.
Sorry?
Dead and unseen.
Yeah.
In the cul-de-sac.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And unable to make, sense of the world around us. So you get the idea here that meaning making, it's like an operating system. It's like an underlying grammar that determines how we come to understand things. And thankfully, we can grow the complexity and capability of that meaning making. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here today, is how do we create environments that bring that that developmental unfolding, or enhance that developmental unfolding. Okay. So yeah.
No, you go for it, Michael.
Okay. Part of our work then is to bring deliberate focus to developing meaning-making complexity both in and around us. So I know that I think all of us are coaches, we're facilitators, we're mentors, we're teachers, and there are things that we mentor and teach and coach. And much of that happens in the domain of what we sometimes call horizontal learning. And what we're talking about here is in the domain of what developmental psychologists call vertical learning, which is the growing and developing the complexity of our meaning making. And what we're saying here is that part of our work is to pay deliberate attention to that dimension of human performance.
Yeah. And maybe I can add this, so as agile coaches, we are aware of this something, but we don't often have the language. We can't language it. Okay. So whenever we talk about agile mindset, if we look at the underlying beliefs and the mental complexity, i.e. the meaning making that needs to be present for a leader, or for anybody for that matter, to have an agile mindset, we are in fact referring to more complex meaning making than what is currently there.
Yeah, exactly. And you could say that developing more complex meaning making is an idea whose time has almost come. And it's certainly necessary, because we're not going to get out of the pickle that we're in until we can grow our capacity for more complex meaning making. We've already come up with all the solutions we can possibly come up with. We have all of the technology we can possibly come up with. By the way, this is true in our organizations too. We have everything that we need. We don't need to develop any more tools. We don't need to develop any more structures or systems. What we do need to develop is this inner meaning-making capability, both within us and the people around us. Have we made that point emphatically enough, do you think, Antoinette?
I think so.
We'll see. Okay. So now the question for this session becomes, so we can now refine the question that's sort of at the heart of the session. Now we can ask the question, what's the nature of the learning environment that increases this deeper capacity for inner agility? And notice that we want to emphasize the word environment. Okay, so that's going to be a big word in what's to come. And we want to refine our understanding of who you are. And by the way, I say you, but I also mean me, and I mean me and Antoinette, who we are. You are at all times a catalyzer of meaning-making capacity in and around you. So consider that, just kind of hold that for yourself as we proceed, that that's who you are at all times. And what we're talking about right now, incidentally, consider that everything that we're talking about right now, that as a catalyzer of meaning-making capacity in and around you, it happens regardless of where you are. You could be having an interaction at the grocery store, and who you are is a catalyzer of meaning-making capacity in and around you. You're in a conversation with your child or with your mother or with your, whatever, that it's always who you are. And to the degree that you hold this for yourself, it's going to become increasingly natural for you to bring this capacity in the really important moments in your life. And typically these have to do with our workplaces and our families. Okay. All right. So in order to do this, you need to be able to design and hold deliberately developmental environments. So we've just introduced a term. And so we're going to explore that. We're going to unpack that. What is it? What do we mean by deliberately developmental environment? So a deliberately developmental environment is one whose elements, it's an environment whose elements are engineered and designed to foster expanded meaning-making capability in ourselves and in others. So it's about as pithy as we could get for a definition. And much of the rest of this session is about kind of expanding out on that or elaborating on that. What do we mean by this? What do we mean by that? So it entails both design and holding. So we're going to say a bit more about what we mean by holding as this unfolds. Holding is a strange word, but it's really, for doing this kind of work, it's really, really key that it seems that most development happens in a kind of holding. Okay, so what are the design principles and elements of a deliberately developmental environment? So we want to, yeah, please.
Yeah, so if we look at the work of Winnicott and Keegan and developmental psychologists in general, there's a definition, and we've shared this with you before. There's a definition of what a holding environment looks like for this kind of work. So first of all, there needs to be psychological challenge in the environment. I mean, obviously, if we being deliberately developmental, there needs to be some developmental goals that are currently out of reach, that are outside of the worldview of those that we are working with, that we're facilitating, coaching, working with, leading. So that's the first thing. And I don't know if you remember, I'll put the links in the, Michael, you can let it in. I've just tried to let it in using your screen. Sorry, somebody's in the waiting room.
Yeah, I just let it in.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll put the links in the chat in a moment. But we spoke about psychological challenge, that specific aspect in the Evolve Agility 2 webinar about creating, how we create heat experiences. So you may cast your mind back and recall. But we spent some time doing that. Okay. Then
So,
also, sorry, Michael.
let me just add a little bit on challenge too, that for me anyways, psychological challenge always involves what in developmental psychology they call a disorienting dilemma. And a disorienting dilemma is a moment of psychological challenge, honestly, in which we are faced with a moment in which the old meaning-making category, the current predominant meaning-making categories can't deal with Like, and we often, and by the way, meaning making is not just in the head, it's in the body, right? It's in our whole self, our whole body gets involved in meaning making. It's a somatic activity as much as it is a mental and cognitive activity. But a disorienting dilemma is one in which we realize that that we're kind of at an impasse in terms of being able to make meaning of this moment in a way that renders us resourceful in this moment. And so we're in that space in between, you know, a non-working set of categories and some kind of open field in which some new category will eventually emerge, which it does, right? But that's the nature of the psychological challenge. And so this is a hint for you as facilitators and coaches of deliberately developmental environments. This is the importance of being able to hold these moments with people, because they're really hard. And we want to be firm, we want to be loving, but we want to hold it, right? Okay.
So the next one is psychological support. Michael, you can just.
Oh, sorry.
Click.
Fell asleep on my job here.
The psychological support. So if we look at how development happens for human beings, if we want to create those disorienting dilemmas, and we want to not have them break out into their panic zone, but just into their stretch zone, so that it's not completely overwhelming, whatever kind of heat experiences we create for them, then there needs to be enough support in the environment. There needs to be, I mean, we like to throw that word around ad nauseum in the agile world, a psychological safety, so but it's beyond psychological safety. It also needs to, we need to be able to see where we need to step in, where, what exactly is it that they require. Now, in one-on-one coaching, it's potentially easier for us to see that, because this is exactly what we do in one-on-one coaching as well. We also create a developmental holding environment. But if we want to work with the groups that we work with, and we, Michael and I certainly believe that that's a more impactful way of working with groups, then you also need to be able to create this inside a group that you are working with.
Yeah, and I would say that I basically don't do one-on-one coaching. I do coaching within the context of groups, and have since the very beginning. When I studied professional coaching, I immediately gravitated to group coaching, and now and those of you who've been in workshops or programs with me or with us, you've seen that a lot of it is doing one-on-one coaching within the context of groups, right? And presenting certain challenges. But the groups, what happens is that, and one of the things that I love about groups is that there's a very subtle thing that happens psychologically in groups, in the domain of group psychology, or in the domain of intersubjective experience, that when somebody is in a challenging moment, if what they're also observing is that person is being held, their hearts literally soften, and there's a softening in the psychological environment that that's just, it creates almost like this incredible feeling of warmth. And those of you who've been in those sorts of learning environments know exactly, can relate exactly to this. So psychological support is a really deep and very profound condition, a necessary condition for the holding environment.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen automatically. Mm-hmm. So it's necessary for us to know. Yeah. It's necessary for us to know how to do it, and also to really take the time to do it. Yeah. So generally, these kinds of these kinds of changes to allow these kinds of changes to happen, it doesn't happen in a 2 or 3 day workshop. It can, there can be some shifts there, but the real deep, profound, lasting changes, you know, needs a, if you don't only want to have a state experiences, which is what a workshop gives us, you need to have a longitudinal contact with a group in order to create that that stage shift.
So the last piece is learning tools, and learning tools are just they are well, like, quite literally almost like tools that assist in the kind of learning that's appropriate to the development that's being, you know, catalyzed, or that's being sort of held and supported. And we'll say more about, like, we'll give some examples of learning tools a little bit later here. Okay, so that's a kind of like, that's like a meta design. It's kind of like a, you know, you could say that this is a sort of design heuristic for deliberately developmental environments. And now we want to share an example of one way of modeling a deliberately developmental environment. It's definitely not the only way, but it's what's been evolving, you know, certainly in my work over the years. This has evolved a lot, by the way, since the book came out. And those of you who've read the book, this is one area where I've really moved quite far away from what was in the book. Okay, so there are 4 meta design elements, and the first of these, and these are elements, these are design conditions that need to be present, and all of them need to be present in order for the possibility of catalyzing a vertical shift can happen. And so you need all 4 of these. And the first of these is heat experience, what we call heat experiences. And a heat experiences, again, we mentioned earlier, that's this is, by the way, related very directly to psychological challenges. They're reflective and situational challenges that reorient the categorizing, sense-making categories under which people operate. So it brings about those disorienting dilemmas. And there are other kinds of experiences that people have in the face of heat experiences. The second design element, or the second design condition, is the presence of stretch practices. And stretch practices they can be personal practices, they could be conversational practices. So in our work, we do a lot with conversational practices, or they could be collective practices, you know, like practices that maybe teams and groups do together in relation to the collective in order to see something or experience something. But these are practices that are designed to psychoactivate developmental growth. So I'll just give you a brief example. I used to be, along with Lisa Adkins and Michael Spade, we were at the Agile Coaching Institute some years ago, and we used to teach this class called Coaching Agile Teams. And one of the signature moments of that class happens in the afternoon of day 1, where we introduce a couple of professional coaching practices. The first one of which is what we called focused listening, or level 2 listening. And focused listening is, it's moving from, you know, a listening that's just paying attention to your own internal state, your own thoughts, or spacing out, or whatever it is, to kind of turning the focus to the other person and being able to be really present with that other person. And what people found, at first, it was really, really hard to do this. So they would practice this. It was really hard to do this without wanting to say something, or to give advice, or to make suggestions, or to try to fix something. But once people were able to get past that initial hump, they started to see something, the seeing of which shifted their own idea of who they were. Like, they started to see, oh, I don't always have to be this person who provides the answer, or I don't always have to be the person who fixes things for my wife, or for my husband, or whoever, or for my daughter, right? I can provide a space in which they can see their own capability. So that would be an example of what we're calling here stretch practices. They're practices that have the side effect of psychoactivating some inner shift within ourselves or within other people. The social container. So we talked a lot about this a moment ago when we talked about psychological support. So, like doing this kind of work in groups or teams or what, collectives of various sorts, it creates an amazingly powerful container. And those of you who've been exposed to adaptive action and what's her name? I forget her name. I always forget names when I'm doing webinars and stuff. But yeah, so adaptive action, and there's the containers, differences, and exchanges, right? And it's this idea that we catalyze social containers like we catalyze the other things here. So a moment ago, Antoinette suggested that there's a way in which we hold the container, the social container, such that it can, enact the qualities of the container that we're referring to here. And then finally, something that we call a bigger game, and this is a kind of a goal, but it's not like a goal, to make a certain amount of money, per year, or even like a product goal, say for a team or a delivery team, or maybe for leadership teams, some sort of organizational goal or some sort of enterprise goal. But this is a goal about us, or about me, about how I might get better, how I might leverage my own developmental growth, for the sake of my own continued development, or maybe even the development of others. So in the old days, I used to call, when I worked with teams, I differentiated the outer product, which is what teams are building in terms of software or whatever, and then the inner product, which is what teams are building in terms of their own capability, like having a kind of developmental goal. And that's what this bigger game refers to. Okay, so
Michael, I'm wondering whether we let people digest this a little bit before we step into the example.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. In fact, we could even take some questions if we wanted to, just even clarifying questions, or noting, by the way, that we will have some Q&A time at the end as well. But just there may be some clarifying questions, or just whatever, because we're gonna provide an example in just a moment of this, and then you're gonna do a little bit of just playing around with this in a couple of moments. So some questions or comments or anything that wants to be brought in. Shall I leave the screen up? Anyone, or shall I feel like I'd like to bring us back together again. Yeah. Shall I do that? Can't find my cursor. There it is. Okay, cool. All right. Nice to see everybody. Cool. So any questions or anything?
So it seems to me that there needs to be some kind of inciting thing that needs to happen for people to want to enter into something like this. What if they're not willing to or able to see that there might be such a thing happening in their lives? Like if their conditions are such that everything is seemingly okay from their point of view, but maybe not from other people's points of view, then what?
Well, I'll take a kind of a stab at that. I think the first thing I would do is to bring the people who have a different view of things together and have a conversation. So that would be an example of sense making, like deliberate sense making, like what assumptions, how is it that I construct the world, or that we construct the world such that we see that there are aspects of your performance that are problematic, and can I be transparent about that? And then other people do the same thing, so you have a shared sense making conversation to determine, like, where are we, right? Because I certainly would not advocate pushing anything like this onto people who aren't a request for this. So it's like my old adage, I never coach anyone who's not a request for coaching, And so how does that kind of land overall?
Very, very well. Yeah. Thank you.
And I don't think I've ever worked with a group where there wasn't some expectation of this happening, even if we didn't know what to call it.
Mm. Hmm.
So,
Mm.
so for me, for a long time, I had this feeling about something that needs to shift, but I didn't have the language for it. And I knew when it did in certain people and when it didn't in others. And there is, I mean, if we think in reality, what happens for us in life, we shift into more mental complexity, generally through impactful events, through traumatic events. So somebody has cancer, somebody loses their job, and that requires a different way of looking at the world to get through the experience. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to, if there is an appetite for it, when people are ready for it, when they notice something is not working in their lives, they cannot solve their problems anymore, the life doesn't work for them anymore the way that it used to, is to then be able to step in and provide support and challenge in order to let that happen in a less traumatic way. So the signal to me that there's scope here is when people have their hands in their hair about how do I negotiate that. That doesn't mean you swoop in, but it means that then the work can begin to to sort of gently and carefully probe at, are they ready? Are they ready for this kind of work?
There's a lot more. I think I'm going to add just one sentence, and I'm not going to explain it. Right. So consider that part of the job of leaders is to engineer breakdowns for people, but getting out of which is going to require that something shift developmentally for them. Okay, maybe one or two other questions. Just, we're wanting to get somewhat friendly with this stuff, and maybe even friendly with each other.
Yeah, like I love to hear a little bit about meeting those folks where they are. And I mean this in terms of developmental growth, right? Like what I make up about this is that the heat experiences and the stretch practices and the bigger game are all related to where people currently are, or where the team or group or organization currently are.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wonder is how much the design of those experiences, practices, and bigger game are tied to where they are developmentally.
Yeah, so I would say, thank you. Someone put Glenda Oyang in the chat a while ago. Just not seeing it. Yeah, absolutely. You can't. You've got to start where people are at, right? And later on, we're going to talk about. By the way, I'm putting a screenshot of that diagram up here. So yeah, you've got to meet people where they're at, right? But there's a certain kind of finesse here. All of this, I would assert, works regardless of where people are at developmentally. Mm-hmm. Even those who are operating at using Bill Torbert's model, expert action logic, right? Which is I'm not going to explain it, but even people operating at a fairly relatively lower developmental level, this work works, right? So this I mean, I didn't understand what I was doing at the time, but I did this kind of work with software development teams. And, they weren't interested in having, reflective, like kind of having conversations about, how they feel about things and all of that. They weren't ready for that, right? But so you meet them where they're at, but then it's like you meet them where they're at, but kind of like with little Trojan horses, and those of you who don't know what I mean by Trojan horse, it's basically it's a way of having a more advanced idea implanted with people, and they don't even necessarily know it until it starts to sprout seeds in them. I feel like I'm not explaining this very well.
No, Michael, what I was thinking about, so you brought up coaching agile teams. So if I think about in that course as well, we engineered a breakdown. There was the morning of the second day, we engineered a breakdown in sharing leadership, the basics of leadership development for people, which then created an appetite for further learning. So to me, that was the Trojan horse that we used, for instance, there was, well, you want to know how to work with these leaders that don't want to shift, that don't get it, the common complaint we hear in the agile community. And how we shared it with them created a breakdown for them, so that there was a realization of, this sits behind, I didn't see this before. And this is what sits behind both the leaders, but also it sits in me, so that the work could begin on the self in order to have the work happen out there. So
yeah, so there's something to be said about, like, especially people who are at earlier stages, it is to create breakdowns, engineer breakdowns. Like, I think I shared an example in a previous webinar about this leader who insisted that his software development teams up the level of their velocity. I'm not going to get into all this bullshit about velocity, right? Okay, let's just put that aside. But basically, he presented to them a performance challenge, the meeting of which required these teams to rethink how they operate, how they interact with one another, how they relate to folk, all that kind of stuff. And it created an environment. It was rather stressful, but it really spoke to people, especially of earlier action logics, who aren't necessarily motivated by the goal of personal development for the sake of personal development, right? Is this useful? Is this a useful response, Ken?
Yeah, I think so. It's, it sounds to me like there's a bit of an art and a science to figuring out what the heat experiences might be for them.
Yeah, that's right. And so, something that, there definitely is an art and a science to it. Yeah, definitely. Okay, I feel like we should move to the example.
We don't. Okay. So, and then do breakout rooms, transparent facilitator moments. Then do the breakouts. Okay.
Sure.
Cool.
Sure.
We can do that.
All right. So I'll go back to sharing the screen. So we're going to give you an example. By the way, here's the hazard of examples. There's no better way to elicit yeah buts than to give an example, and then an even better way is to give a second example, and an even better way is to give a third example, right? So I'm not a huge fan of giving examples, and I used to argue with leadership teams who would, in the old days, who would say, well, can you give us some examples of other companies who have done this? And I would say no, and here's why: because it will not help you. Because I'll give you one example and you'll say, yeah, but that's not how it works here. And it's that yeah, but it's that tendency to yeah, but, and it's that tendency to want to get outside confirmation and then reject it. That's your very problem. That's the very source of why you're having such a hard time as a leadership team. You idiots. I was a pretty nice guy. Okay, cool. Okay, with all of that said, about examples, here is an example, and I think, oh, right, okay, good. Okay, so this is for a senior leadership team. So the heat, here's a couple of examples of heat experiences. These are one of potentially many. I mean, there are a couple of potentially many.
Yeah. So, so this is a senior leadership team that I worked with, and they had a particular request when I started working with them. So they had a particular request. They had particular problems that they wanted to solve. Okay. So in my work with them, and it's not time related how we're going to go through it. So this is what happened in general. So one of the things that I try to do with them, they were in, I didn't ever do a formal assessment with them, but from my informal assessment, most of the team were either in expert mode or in achiever mode. Some early individualists in one or two of them, but they were their center of gravity certainly was in expert and in achiever. Okay, so I know that one of the things that helps us shift in our achiever to later stages is our ability to deal with paradoxes. So that was one of the techniques that when I facilitated them, that I often used, is to, instead of letting them work with, letting them come to those answers quickly, to relieve the discomfort of staying in, in that paradox, I kept them there, and and invited them to stay there with me. Okay, because just the practice of sitting in that paradox eventually brings forth things that they never thought of, and also opens up to them perspectives that they didn't know they had. A very easy and necessary thing was to start replacing long-term planning with experimental learning. And the way, so it's a little bit to what you were saying, Ken. So the way I got them to say, yes, we'll accept your invitation to start doing that, is because of the problems that they were having at the time. So some of the problems that they were experiencing in their current way of being, here was something that I invited them to try, that I knew was going to create a breakdown for them. So that's some examples of heat experiences.
Yeah, and I want to just briefly say we should probably move a little faster, because I want to. I have an idea as to what we might do instead of what we had talked about.
Okay, cool.
But anyways, I want to pick a comment. Can you imagine? So at some point we would want to say something like, "What does this require of you?" So can you imagine, holding space with a leadership team in doing the kind of work that Antoinette just described? So all of this requires our own, we have to become skillful. We also have to become really good at managing our own experience and managing our own sort of emotional reactions to, want to get out of it, because these are heat experiences for us as well.
Most definitely. So Michael, can you just advance?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Okay. So, and so some stretch practices. So I taught them about collective sense making, introduced them about this collective sense making, not in a lot of detail, but enough so that the problem solving conversations started changing. And what I did, I just introduced two terms in terms of vocabulary for vertical development, expert or achiever. And I would specifically bring in the sense-making conversations that they would have, I brought in specifically the practice of, okay, so are you speaking from your expert now, or are you speaking from your achiever? And just that little bit of vocabulary, help them to answer more questions, answer questions differently, and become aware of where they were coming from. Okay, so you can move on, Michael. I've got my feet on the gas pedal now. In terms of a social container, so designed alliances, and facilitating that in a coach-like fashion. So really being able to keep their feet to the fire, and also, there's a term from my coaching school called lion's roar. So being able to sit with that tension that's in the air when a team goes from centralized, strong CEO that talks a lot and just gets people to agree with what he says, to bringing every voice into the room. Okay. So part of that was a conflict protocol. Nobody ever opposed him. So, coming up with a conflict protocol about how they would handle conflict, how he would invite conflict, how he would be with conflict when it happens, forming them into a real team where that psychological support and that psychological challenge was welcomed, and it was safe to do so, and it was expected to do so. And a big part of that was simply teaching them to give feedback on a regular basis. So establishing a culture of feedback, not only negative feedback, but especially positive feedback as well. So, yeah, Michael, you can hop to the last one. So ultimately, what they came up with, the underlying desire of why this whole thing, why they got me involved in the first place, through time, they realized that what they were looking for was to access the organization's collective intelligence and really get innovation coming from everybody. So that was the focus.
So some questions about that. In a moment, we're going to invite you to kind of play around with some of this for yourself. So this is one example of potentially infinite examples of how this work might be done, say, with a leadership team. And so questions about that?
Yeah, I'm curious about the impact, Antoinette. Like what's give me the story ending a little bit briefly.
So what happened was, the CEO didn't shift. He left, actually. Okay. In the rest of the team, there was one person that shifted tremendously. Okay. So, and actually he also left because it became too constraining for him. And they grew into a real team, so with all the benefits of that, and the psychological challenge and support that's in a real team. Okay. Two of the actually, there was an impact not only in internal shifting, but also in their impact, their real impact in the world. Okay. So I don't know, I mean, you leave teams to continue with that work. I coached the person that really shifted. I coached him individually for about a year afterwards. Okay. And he continues to grow. He's gone into another company, into a CEO position, actually. Two of the people that stayed behind, they shifted as well. And then the other 4 people were they were happy to be part of the real team. And, there was much more collaboration, but they weren't really that interested in, you know, in moving, like doing dramatic shifts. So they showed up in a different way. You know, the team itself became a lot more, a lot better functioning. But yes, there were about 4 members of the team that maybe their shift there was an internal shift from being siloed individual workers to, working for the greater goal. But yeah, they weren't, they didn't shift that much. So
Yeah, I find it interesting that people sort of self-selected out of the system
yes, yes,
once it started to coalesce
yes,
for people.
yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
And a learning for me from that system as well is, if if you want to shoot out the lights, you need to work with the mother company that's back in the UK as well, not only the South African company. Because if the old thinking persists, it's very hard for those that stay there to have the impact that they need and work in the way that they want, and that's why they leave. So.
So here's the question. How might you take an element of this into your own environment? So we were originally thinking that of people being in breakouts, but it might be better to do this here. And you could take a moment maybe to think about it and jot it down. And this is in the spirit of, let's play with this just a little bit, and then that'll move us into a kind of a conversation. So take maybe a few minutes to jot down some thoughts. Yes, Will.
What I'm realizing, because I'm thinking with some systems that I've worked with, what I'm realizing is that your heat experiences naturally tend to come from changes that affect value exchange in the system. So when you start messing with the boundary of one system and how it relates to another system within a collective or a larger system, that is when you naturally start to unearth or encourage emergent breakdowns or heat experiences within the system. And you can't always predict it.
Yep. Great, good. So you reminded me of something that's really important to say in all of this, which is, and we debated whether or not to bring this in, but we need to bring it in. There are, in addition to what we've shared with you, are certain meta practices, and one meta practice is the practice of developmental reflection. So when there's a breakdown, we have to have an opportunity for us to apply new vocabularies for making sense of it. So it's simply not enough to engineer breakdowns. This is again part of the psychological support and the learning tools. The learning tools provide ways for us to apply new categories and making sense of the new breakdowns. If we don't have that, it's just more of the same, right? All right. Does that feel like it responded to the spirit of your question, or?
Yeah. So that was part of what I wanted to add to that, and it's encouraging that I think I'm sensing into that. So obviously, if you're making sense in the same way and you're seeing the system in the same way, it's not going to shift. Your heat experience is basically going to cause a crisis or disintegration.
That's right.
And it stimulates an immune response. So what you want from the system is you want power from within, which requires development of new categories. So either it's the development of new categories, or you provide different ways of seeing it so that they can actually make sense of it in a different way. And that's how the system naturally evolves, or you actually
Mhm.
support them to evolve. And obviously the supporting part is faster.
Right. Right. So,
Yeah.
so the kinds of things that we're talking about here are covered. So we want to share a little bit with you upcoming things in which we go much more deeply into these matters. But this is critically important, that those of us who facilitate this kind of work, we call it vertical facilitation. When we facilitate this kind of work, we really have to, besides having nerves of steel, as Antoinette has, we have to have kind of like a set of, like a vocabulary and a set of ways of introducing what we call distinctions, and which helps people to see things in a new way. So it helps people to reintegrate experiences which, when held within an older category, would be disempowering, but held in a new category could be ultimately empowering. I know that probably sounds rather abstract. I apologize. We only have a few minutes left. Cool. That's great. That's awesome. Well, thank you for that. So you guys have been writing some things down. By the way, I say guys in a non-gender, in a gender neutral way. What are some ideas or things that you've come up with? Maybe questions that have arisen.
Yeah, I was going to say all I've come up with is questions. So one of the big questions for me is probably, how do we establish the credibility, if you will, that we are able to provide the holding environment for something like this? And following from that, would we make an invitation? Would we describe what we offer somehow? And then, of course, you go into like, well, how do you make a description of an offer resonate with, if it were expert logic or achiever logic? So
Right.
those are all the questions that are coming up for me now.
Yeah, so all of that falls within the domain, with the being dimension of all of this. So there's a being dimension, which is our own vertical capacity, right? But it's also, there's a certain skillfulness and a certain, it goes back to what I suggested a little while ago. If who you're being is a catalyzer of, developmental or, just transformative moments, if that's who you're being, like you treat that as a kind of personal discipline, and you orient your own personal development and development of skillful means around that, then it's going to be natural, that you'll enroll the people who are ready to be enrolled into something like this. And by enroll, I don't mean have them sign up for something, but I mean enrollment in the sense of a conversation in which someone sees a new possibility for themselves and are willing to step into action in relation to that possibility. So if who you are is in relationship with people, which for me is like the foundation of all of this kind of work, that who you are is in relationship with people, which means that you are able to be with people exactly as they are, that you have no preference, you're not trying to get them to be anywhere. When you can be with people that way, and you have a clear sense of like the possibility for people, then it becomes quite natural to begin to engage in the kinds of conversations in which people come to a place of choice. They may not be ready for it right now, but you'll never know until there's a kind of quality of cleanness in the way that you relate with people and interact with people. I don't know if that was helpful.
I'm wondering.
I don't know how to nod harder, but yeah, thank you.
I'm wondering, how does that relate to the part of the bigger game, where we have this larger vision and a shared commitment?
You mean their bigger game or our bigger game? My bigger game.
The bigger game of the holding environment.
You mean, say, as in an organizational environment?
whoever that may be, huh?
Okay.
It could be this shared commitment could be of everybody within that environment.
Yeah. So to the degree that I can be in relationship with this person and be in relationship to that bigger game as a possibility, as a field of possibility. I'm using a little bit of lingo with you, Jos, since you and I have been together. But then a certain kind of resonance can happen with this person or with this group of people.
Hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Let's see. That's why someone said this is an art and a science. It's an art and a science and a practice. It's lots of different things. So there's a whole finesse. And I think for both of Antoinette and me, the biggest thing here is the finesse. And the finesse comes from a way of being, and it also comes from a kind of skillful means. And the basic skillful means, I was just working with a group of coaches who work with executive leaders, and they were in this very kind of inquiry. And so much of it just comes back down to, who are you being? Right? And what's the, how it's when you relate with somebody, can you see them as a possibility? Like the possibility of who they might be.
And that in itself is a catalyzer already.
That's right. Exactly right. That's right. When you start seeing them, when you start interacting with them, it's like one of my teachers used to say, usually we are accustomed to, whenever we encounter bullshit from people, we interact with their bullshit. We try to manage and handle their bullshit. And he says, no, what you do is you give space to their bullshit and you keep interacting with them as though they're God.
Yeah.
And they're going to keep throwing bullshit at you. You just give space to it. It's like, no big deal. Okay, God, what else do you got? And finally, at some point, they run out of bullshit and something real can happen.
Yes. Thank you.
I had my hand up earlier, but you've kind of answered the question that I was going to ask around having that skill to have your signal to noise at such a low level that you can clearly articulate what it is that you want them to get to without getting in the way yourself.
Yes.
And that takes.
I love that. It's like being able to discern the signal, both in that other person or those other people, or in this system, right? And being able to discern the signal versus the noise within ourselves.
Yeah.
Not always so easy to do.
If only.
Yeah, there's a lot of the time you can see it before they can, but what are you seeing?
Yeah.
Are you seeing truly what's there, or are you seeing something that you're projecting on what's there?
Yeah.
And even if you see that, what are they ready for?
Right. So we don't want to spin this as though this is some esoteric art, right? There are esoteric arts like shamanic arts, and I don't want, it's like, to be a practitioner of this, you've got to be on a shamanic journey for 30 years, and we don't want to paint it like that. It's actually, this is totally doable. And these are skills and practices and capabilities that, at least to a considerable degree, most of us can develop if with commitment and a willingness to really apply ourselves. I mean, you should have seen me, like, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago or whatever. I was terrible in front of groups. I couldn't, it was so hard for me. Anyways.
I mean, the same thing, our growth gets brought about by the same thing.
Yeah.
that we use to bring growth about in other people.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So
Yeah, yeah, right. So we're kind of rounding the bend here, and I want to just take an opportunity to share with you some things that are coming up. And so we don't we haven't gotten, like, there are some webinars. I forgot to add like a couple of things here. So let me just share the screen one last time to share with you what's coming up. And so one thing that's coming up is, so we have these different kinds of workshops and programs and things like that, and as well as clinics. So we've got a clinic that's coming up on conversational practices, and I forget the date of that. We're going to have an events page on our website probably next week, and so you'll get some more information. And if you're on our mailing list, you'll get information. If you're not, I don't know, we have to somehow get people a way to get on our mailing list. Probably everyone here is on our mailing list. But anyway, so here are some other events. So there's the Conversational Practices Clinic that's coming up, I think in December. Why is this not working? Oh, there we go. So one workshop is a kind of a mini workshop that's coming up, is we call it Getting It Right, Problem Solving Intelligence for High Performing Teams. And this is a kind of almost like an entry level sort of course. It's focused on conversational practices that help teams, and interaction practices that help teams and collectives just get better at problem solving intelligence, like getting better at solving problems together collaboratively. And we have one of these in November, and another which is kind of tailored for the European crowd, and then another that's more tailored for the North American crowd in terms of time zone. We have a workshop coming up in January, Evolve Agility, Growing an Agile Leadership Culture from the Inside Out. And that's a more advanced program for facilitators. And it combines both, kind of the inner development requirements of doing this kind of work, and then specific conversational relationship and systems, presencing practices and skills. So this is a multi-day, it's a much deeper kind of workshop that really gets into the art and science of deliberate sense making and deliberate meaning making. I'm particularly working with both individuals and groups and teams, and that's coming in January. And then the kind of the more advanced program for those of you who have a more of a commitment to this kind of thing, the art and science of vertical facilitation. And that is going to be a multi-month program. And that's where we really get into the nitty-gritty and the great depth of this kind of work. And people who come out of this program can expect to be able to have a significant impact in bringing deliberately developmental work in any sort of situation. So this is particularly powerful for those who work with leadership teams, but useful and powerful for work with any kinds of collectives, or even to some degree individuals. And that's coming in February. So look for announcements for these things and other things, so there will be more webinars coming up, more clinics, and just a variety of ways for you to kind of really dive deep into this work. There'll probably be more videos, and I can't find my cursor. There it is. There'll be more videos. So we continue to engage in this, and our commitment is to provide a kind of an environment in which you can continue to develop, in whatever way and whatever speed is suitable for you. Cool. All right, here we are again. Ulrika has a wonderful looking dog there, it looks like. So let's maybe let's just take a moment to be here together, and then we'll do our final kind of checkout. this kind of ability to be present with the system is one of the skills in vertical facilitation with groups. To hold this manner of presence even with people who aren't ready for this. So I'd like for us to complete our time together by just each of us taking a moment to say what you're leaving the session with. You know, something you could say maybe in a breath, a single breath. I'm leaving the session, and whatever's here for you, present.
I'm leaving the session with wonder.
I leave this session with possibility.
I'm leaving with gratitude.
I found a recurring question: into what?
I'm leaving with a desire to rush into this and a desire to resist that rushing.
Leaving with a creative desire.
And I'm leaving with inspiration and some new thoughts around an ongoing thing.
I'm leaving with reflective questions.
Yeah, I'm leaving with the curiosity and curiosity around how to design this breakdowns, creating this heat. This is something that really resonated with me.
Echo, how are you leaving?
Well, I'm leaving with, I love the word wonder. I am leaving with wonder at what happens when human beings come together and in deliberate sense making.
And I'm leaving nurtured.
Okay, so we really look forward to seeing all of you around. Feel free to, we will email you a link to the video. Feel free to share the video with friends and colleagues. And I will also, just occurred to me, I'll also send you a paper, send you a kind of a longish white paper. It gets into details around what we call deliberate sense making, and so you'll receive that as well, and you're free to share that with other people as well. Okay, with that we say adieu, or
Have
au
a good
revoir.
Friday and weekend.
Oh,
Adieu.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.